and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke media briefing on the aftermath of the 2020 election. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications and I'm moderating this event. Joe Biden is widely accepted as the winner of the election, but the Trump administration continues to stall despite its claims of ballot fraud gaining no traction in the courts. What does this mean for the transition of power in this country, and what could the effects be beyond the White House? We have two Duke professors of public policy and political science with us today to discuss the path forward. And hold on just a second. Sounds like we're getting some interference from somewhere. Not sure if somebody has a website open that's causing some noise. Okay, I'm gonna proceed. Sorry about that. Not sure where some of the disturbances are coming from. Anyway, so sorry about that. Yes, we have two Duke professors of public policy and political science with us today to discuss the path forward. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today is Peter Feaver. He was a special advisor for strategic planning and institutional reform on the National Security Council staff in the George W. Bush administration and was director for defense policy and arms control in the Clinton administration. He also directs the Duke program in American Grand Strategy. Good morning to you.
Thanks for having me.
And we have Bruce Gentleson. He was a senior advisor at the State Department during President Barack Obama's first term. He worked on Obama's 2012 presidential campaign and that of Al Gore in 2000. He also worked in the State Department in the 1990s and is the author of a book on 20th century statesmanship. Good morning to you.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. And Professor Gentleson, we'll start with you. Not only has President Trump not conceded, but the General Services Administration has not signed off on allowing the transition to begin. The Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has expressed support for the president, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said yesterday he was preparing for a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. How much does all this affect Biden's ability to prepare to govern right now?
So transitions really have two main purposes: affirmation and preparation. Affirmation is that handshake that in every other instance has occurred right after the election between the outgoing president and the president-elect, and the notion that the constitutional system is working, that we fight hard and we play by the rules. You know, a very high-level version of why Duke and UNC basketball players shake hands at the end of the game. We're not seeing any of that, and I think the fundamental effect of that is extremely negative. There are a lot of very strained legal arguments going on. Well, everybody knows what the Trump administration is doing. And that's very important to the system, not just to President-elect Biden. The preparation, though, is very much Biden's team. You could go over to his Build Back Better website, and they already announced what they call the landing teams, the people for every cabinet department and many agencies who are ready to get the binders and to start the preparation of what you need to do to hit the ground running. And unfortunately, in an administration which has done so much damage to the federal service, to so many areas, leaving aside policy differences, but just to the structure of government, it's even more essential that we get moving on this. And so both of those areas are being damaged. You know, the affirmation part in terms of our core norms and the preparation part on COVID and any number of other issues that President-elect Biden really wants to hit the ground running on.
Sure, thank you very much. Lots to dig into there, but Professor Feaver, I'd like to come over to you. One of the most significant things we've seen in the last couple of days is the firing of Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and some of the other removal of civilian leaders at the Pentagon. How much does that complicate the transition process, and does it decrease stability in the department and for American civilians and troops overseas between now and January?
It's a great question. First, let me just add underscore something that Bruce said, which is that the delay in transition is not helpful. But the good news is that the Biden team is the A team. They have a lot of governing experience among them, especially the president-elect himself. And so if you're going to do this to an incoming team, or put it another way, if there was going to be an incoming team that could overcome this problem, well, I would say it's the Biden's team. Of course, the Trump team should move forward and go back to regular order of transition. That would be in the country's interest. But I have confidence that the Biden team are not sitting around waiting for something. They are moving out, and they have the capacity to do so. Now, as to your question about DOD, this is with a legal move by the president. It's within his prerogatives to do it, but it's not a wise thing for him to do. It's hurting him, it's hurting his legacy, and it's hurting the Republican Party's future capacity to hold the Biden administration accountable, doing these kinds of stunts. Now, the real question is, why is he doing? There's some theories floating around that I don't think we need to worry about. I do not believe that what he's doing is clearing the path so he can use the military to hold on to power. That you'd need to do a lot more than just replace a couple people at the top. I don't think that's the problem. I do think it's possible that what he's doing is just settling scores and doing it because people are telling him you can't do it. Many people who work for the president said that's the one way you can get him to act is if you tell him people say you're not allowed to do X, then he's going to go out and do X. Secondly, it's possible that he wants to do some policies that are unwise and that wiser heads have warned him against. And he's trying to clear the deck so he can do those policies, not to hold on to power, but to sort of get some things done at the last minute, declassifying certain bits of information. The final possibility is that the president himself is not even paying attention to these personnel moves. He may not know who the undersecretary or the person acting as undersecretary of policy is. And it could be the people lower around than him in the White House who are seeking to burnish their resume in the last couple of weeks before they have to go out on the job market. And it could be as mundane as that.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Professor Feaver, and thank you both to our panelists for those opening answers. We've got lots to dig into here, and at this point, I'll open it up to questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can type a question in the Q&A window, or you can raise your hand in Zoom so you can ask your question in person. If you happen to be calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and we can unmute you so you can ask your question in person. We have some questions that were submitted in advance, and we'll tackle those now. And Professor Gentleson, I'll come back to you. We've had some questions about this notion of ascertainment. So for anyone unfamiliar, that's the shorthand for the General Services Administration ascertaining the apparent successful candidate in the election, signing off on the launch of the handover of power in terms of access to buildings and funds to fill slots. Now, one of the questions we've had is what, if anything, specifically could the Biden administration do to maneuver around ascertainment, since that seems to be the holdup right now?
Yeah, this normally is very pro forma. You know, I suspect most people didn't know the head of the General Services Administration before the name was announced in this area. And again, you know, Bill Clinton did it with George Bush. George Bush did it with Barack Obama. You know, and every other transition. I think what Peter said is right. I mean, the Biden team and President-elect Biden's message was, we're going to do our work. You know, we're going to move ahead. There's a lot of analysis. Some you need classified information. Some you don't, and you can move ahead with those. So there's much work they can do. It is a lot of people with a lot of policy experience, some private sector experience, some nonprofit domain experience as well. But you take an issue like COVID, right? Where, you know, I would think that almost any other outgoing president, given the crisis the country has been in, we've never had anything that has affected the daily lives of Americans as much as this had, whether it's deaths or job losses or just the inconvenience of having kids at home. 9/11 was profound, but not this profound. Any other president would be sort of trying to work with the incoming administration, saying, okay, you're going to move policy in a different direction. Let me at least give you a little bit of help, because by the time you get here in 70+ days, the problem's going to be a lot worse. So sure, you can do some of your homework, you can do some of your analysis, but while there's only one president at a time, there's a way to, you know, it's like passing the baton in a relay race. There's a way to do this the right way. And what Trump is doing is making it that much harder, not only for the Biden team, but for the country.
So can I just add on to because I agree with Bruce, and add on that ascertainment also releases funds, but that's not a big deal to nowadays. The Biden team has the money they need. And I think Vice President Biden said that money's not going to be the issue. It also releases office space. Again, not a big issue in the Zoom age. It gives them access to translation services at the State Department when they're fielding calls from international leaders. Again, not critical. The really critical thing that they're preventing is the landing teams from connecting up with the receiving teams at each of these departments and agencies who have been preparing up until now and ready to receive them and start briefing the Biden people on the status of negotiations that are pending, status of commitments that have been made and have to be reassessed. All of that stuff is being delayed, and it will slow. Well, it'll increase the likelihood that a ball might be dropped, which is already hard enough to do a transition the way the United States does it, and there's just no point in making it harder.
Sure, absolutely. And Professor Feaver, a follow-up question for you on that. One of the things that the 9/11 Commission highlighted was that the delayed transition to the first George W. Bush administration actually contributed to the country's failure to respond in a timely manner to all the chaos that happened there. Do you think that that is a legitimate possibility here if this transition is forced to drag on?
So specifically what they were referring to in the 9/11 Commission was delay in filling the slots of senior people with their security clearances already finished so that they could then take their office. And that I should have added that to the list of things that could be starting right now. That's a very time-intensive process of filling out security clearances. Most of the people whose names have been released on the landing teams and who are mentioned as likely senior appointments have had security clearances in the past and may even have active ones still today. So that may shorten the time, but it's still a needless delay. And so, yes, it may make it mean that there'll be some weeks go by in the new administration when they don't have the slots filled that they could have filled. Remember, the administration that was hurt the most by that was the Trump administration themselves. They had a really difficult time filling slots precisely because they had mishandled their own transition, not because Obama refused to cooperate with them, but because they hadn't done their own preparation work. So they know how hard it is to hit the ground running after Inauguration Day. And so they should want to help the next team do that better.
Sure. Thank you very much. We've got lots of questions coming in. Thank you very much for that. We will get through as many of them as we can. And Professor Gentleson, I would like to come back to you for one of the questions we've had. The Trump White House has told agencies to proceed with plans for his own February budget, even though he's expected to leave office before then. How can agencies respond to that? What should agencies be doing now with the expectation that we'll actually have a new president by February?
Well, they have to do what they're asked to do, at least, go through the motions, do a little bit of that. When presidents are inaugurated, even under normal conditions, they don't have time to prepare a February 1st budget. So they kind of live with initially what was prepared before them, hopefully prepared in a conscientious way, with political difference, but conscientious, which I don't think you can assume here. And then they make they make changes as they go along, and then they really get set for their October 1st budget. And so I think what's happening now, and this notion of looking over the shoulders, if you're looking for a job in the White House staff, which you probably want to do if you want to pay your bills January 21st, you're going to be fired. The notion of mid-level supervisors who are political appointees, if they see you not carrying out the order, you may lose your job. It's a very difficult position, kind of like the election observers the election people who work in the election results. We've seen incredible public service from people under duress, doing their job, walking through threatening parking lots, going in back doors, all sorts of things. And, I got a lot of respect for public servants, but on that issue and others, they're in a very difficult position.
Sure, absolutely. Professor Feaver, I'd like to come back to something that you said in your opening, and we've had a follow-up question about it. Does the military add any safeguards against orders from an outgoing commander-in-chief to in some way kind of subvert democracy? I know we've never been in this position as a country before, but are there safeguards in place?
Well, the military is prepared to implement every legal order that President Trump gives up until noon on Inauguration Day. President Trump is the commander-in-chief today, legally, constitutionally empowered, and our adversaries around the world need to know that if the president needs to send the military to act to protect the American interests at home or abroad, and he gives a legal order, the military will carry it out without question. So there should be no confusion about that. And I think Vice President Biden has been quite clear in his statements that there's only one commander in chief at a time, and that's President Trump right now. What I believe the question was asking was something different, which is, does the military have a role beyond that to sort of protect the country from unwise orders? And the answer is no. The military does not have a role, a constitutional role, in the selection of the commander in chief. The Constitution lays out a process for that, and there's no role for the military in that process. And I don't foresee it coming to that. It's a political process. There's legal aspects. It may be decided in the Supreme Court, as Bruce remembers vividly in 2000, was ultimately decided in the Supreme Court. There's a role for courts. There's certainly a role for legislatures. There is not a role for the US military.
So just to clarify, I'm sorry, go ahead, Professor.
You say Peter's reference to 2000, maybe I'll make a comment on that. So I was serving as a senior foreign policy advisor to Al Gore. It was in Nashville on election night, briefing international media. And at one point in the evening when Florida was called for us, I was asked actually by BBC, does this mean you're going to win the election? And I babbled something like, well, it's a big country with a lot of time zones. And then 20 minutes later, they took Florida back. And for the next 5 weeks, as the process worked its way through the courts, because there was a basis for the courts in that, it was very, we would get a court ruling that looked like that Al Gore's going to be the next president, and we would have meetings to say, let's get the list ready for Al Gore on who should be in the cabinet, who should be other positions. And then 2 days later, there'd be a decision that would go the other way, and we'd think we were doing this for some archival box for some researcher. But everybody was playing within the same rules. And at the end of the day, when the Supreme Court made its decision, Vice President Gore was an institutionalist. The court had ruled. There's still some pressure on him to, resist it. But he made a decision that what was best for the country, for the political system, was more important than what might be best for his own political interests. And I just feel like we're not seeing that anywhere now. We're not seeing it from the president. We're not seeing it from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Not one bit.
Thank you, Professor Gentleton. That actually leads us into another question that we've had that states that some GOP leaders have said they believe this election will end up in the House, and some say it'll end up in the Supreme Court. Based on your experience and your observations, what do you think the likelihood is of either of those outcomes right now?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I think if it was closer in the Electoral College, it's 279 now, in most senses it's going to go higher. The crazy way we do the Electoral College, you can imagine one or two electors defecting if it was like a 270. And we won't even go into what might be the incentives for them to defect. So I don't really see that path. I think what's happening now, a number of Democratic senators have come forward and said, my colleagues are telling me in the cloakroom, congratulations, please tell Joe Biden, my former Senate colleague, congratulations, but I can't say it publicly. We saw the same thing during impeachment. Republican senators saying behind the scenes, we really think he's dangerous as the president, but we can't say that. I think the person most responsible right now for this, next to President Trump, is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And part of their strategy is what's going on now, and Peter can talk about this too, is positioning for 2024, who might inherit the Trump constituency, and even more to the point, positioning for the Georgia 2 Senate runoffs, keeping that Trump electorate motivated, keeping them excited. Because if those go to the Democrats and it's 50-50, then Chuck Schumer becomes majority leader. But, fundamentally, again, it is politics, but there's a point at which it's deeply irresponsible of Mitch McConnell to be doing what he's doing and setting a tone for the other Republican senators.
Gotcha. Thank you. Professor Feaver, I wanted to come back and just clarify something from your earlier point about presidential orders to the military, because the question asked about safeguards against orders from an outgoing commander-in-chief. Based on what you said, assuming that the election results are certified and Biden is considered the winner, does that mean that essentially the military, after the inauguration, would stop taking former President Trump's calls if we had some bizarre situation in which he was still trying to issue orders?
Absolutely. Up until 11:59, they will take the order from President Trump and implement it. And at 12 o'clock, they will take the order from then President Biden and implement that. The military, there's a sharp distinction between a legal versus illegal order. The military will obey legal orders. They will refuse to carry out illegal orders. But where the more likely scenario is not a patently illegal order, but an unwise order. Let's say the president says, bring all the troops home from Afghanistan by Christmas, regardless of what happens to our allies, regardless of what happens to the peace process. I want to be able to brag that I brought all the troops home. There's no serious military advisor who thinks it would be safe to bring home all of the troops immediately before Christmas. And so they would advise against it. But that would be a legal order. And if the president issued that order, issued it in writing through the normal chain of command, then I believe the US military would carry that out grudgingly, and the country would pay a price for it, but they would carry it out. That would be an unwise but legal order. There's many unwise orders that are legal, and the military carries them out.
Sure. Thank you very much for that additional context. Another question that's come in that I'd like to get both of your perspectives on, and Professor Gentleson, we'll start with you. What does Mike Pompeo's comment yesterday about preparing for a second Trump term do to our relations around the world, if anything?
You know, they tried to cover it, say he was joking. It's kind of like a lot of things President Trump has said, oh, he was only looking for some humor. You know when to use humor and when not to. If you're an experienced elected and official as well as statesman. I think it just caused more concern out there about, what are they trying to do? Not only are they delaying, but, ultimately, what are they trying to do? Are they really trying to undo the results? And for your Secretary of State, who really is in a position that's supposed to represent the country globally, to make that a comment, just cascaded out there. Vice President Biden, his expression yesterday in his press conference was, folks are feeling mildly intimidated. And it was it's well put. I think it was very diplomatic of him to put the word mildly, even though he knows it's much more than that. Look, Pompeo has been said to be positioning himself for 2024. And I think that's everything that these folks are doing now. To me, it's the context of where does Republican Party politics lead them as they go forward from this administration.
Sure, thank you. Professor Feaver, what's your take on Pompeo's comments from yesterday? Anything to add?
I think he was trying for a joke. He smiled right afterwards, and I think it was a joke that fell flat. I've told many jokes myself that have fallen flat, so I can empathize with him. But I think Bruce is right, that when you're Secretary of State and when the situation is as tense as it is now, that's probably not the time to go for the joke. What I found more interesting was his very sharp response to a very good question that he got in the same press conference, asking him, does the challenges to and the leveling of false charges of fraud without any evidence of fraud, do they call into question the integrity of the American electoral process, and thus make it harder for the United States to hold other states accountable when they have leaders who are trying to meddle with the electoral process and hold on to power illegally? The United States for decades has been preaching the gospel of democracy and free and fair elections and handing over power when you lose. And that's been a point of emphasis in Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, to include this one. And Pompeo would tell you that he has messaged that repeatedly around the country, around the world, I should say. And he was asked, well, does the shenanigans that we're seeing now from the Trump campaign, does that undermine America's message abroad? And he got angry, refused to answer it. But I think it's a fair question. I do think that this is complicating our ability to hold other states accountable when they have electoral monkey business. So the answer here is, of course, President Trump has legal recourse to challenge, to ask for recounts, to investigate reasonable allegations of misbehavior, all of the legal processes he should follow. But as Bruce emphasized, the messaging coming from the campaign and particularly from the president himself is far more extreme than that. And it's more reckless messaging. And I think it does complicate America's standing in the world.
Sure. Thank you both very much. Thanks to everybody for the questions. Keep them coming in. For now, we have a hand raised in the chat. So Michael Highland, we're going to unmute you so that you can go ahead and ask your question. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. This is Michael Highland from CBS 17 in Raleigh. I was curious to get your take. We've got a lot of uncalled races in North Carolina, including for president, even though it seems like President Trump is probably going to win here. I'm curious to get your take. To what extent has the cautiousness that we've seen on the part of a lot of media outlets to call some of these races in any way contributed to the Republican Party's efforts to sow doubt about this election and the integrity of it?
Peter, you want to go first? All right.
So ever since the call of Florida had to be withdrawn, and that produced a lot of pressure. I'm talking about in 2000. That produced a lot of pressure on decision desks to be very, very careful in making calls prematurely. And it's not like media, as you know, you're a journalist, you know the pressure to scoop to be first. But this is an area where the price of being first and wrong is so very high. And Fox News, who went early and probably prematurely in calling Arizona for Biden, Biden may well eventually win Arizona, but they called that quite early, and it was sort of a tilting over your skis kind of call. And then watching it seem to possibly go badly for Fox News in the call. Now, I'm not talking about the White House pressure. I'm talking about as the race narrowed and it began to look like maybe it would get too close. I think that caution is what has contributed to a generalized caution on lesser races. But remember, this is a very close election, sharp in certain key states. This is sharply divided. Georgia is a very, very close election margin at the very end. And it's an unusual election in that late arriving ballots or late counting ballots may matter. And so it shouldn't be shocking that news organizations and certifying agencies, departments of state, secretaries of state, I should say, are being cautious. There's not a need. That's not contributing to America's poor standing in the world. The question, though, is that providing cover for a more partisan reaction to it? And perhaps it is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I agree. I think that, at the presidential level, there's huge incentive to being first, and that they really had to manage that. And in fact, when we got to Friday, Saturday, I think the Biden campaign was beginning to put a bit of pressure on the network, saying we've called states, with about the same spread. But down ballot, the incentive is all on the side of not making a mistake, right? And so in North Carolina, Governor Cooper won, but by less than the polls projected. At 5 o'clock on election day, I was told by someone who had talked to one of Senator Tillis's pollsters that Tillis was going to lose. So I think with all of that as context, people are being very cautious about the races and seeing the incentives aren't getting it right, not necessarily being first on those other races.
Sure. Thank you both very much for that. We've had some more questions come in. And so, Professor Johnson, we'll stay with you on this next question. We're talking a lot of inside baseball here, but how could this delay in transition affect a typical American family? Are there effects that they could feel as a result of this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I can think of three things, right away. One is COVID. We're in the middle of a surge. A state like North Dakota, which is a red state, and governors that were in large denial. Now we're saying it's so bad that they're allowing nurses who are COVID positive to go back to hospitals. And so, the continued notion that COVID out there, and it is making it much harder to get a handle on a very serious surge process. We're in North Carolina as well, and so much of the country, I think 43 states or something, are going through surge. So that's one area. And that by the time President Biden were to be able to deal with this January 20th, it could be that much more severe to try to get a handle on. Second is the economy and the inability to put together a second economic financial package for small businesses, for jobs, and everybody's blaming everybody else. Some are blaming Speaker Pelosi, Senator McConnell, the White House. I think if we had an election result, sometimes you get things done in lame duck sessions that you can't get done otherwise. Way back in 1994, I remember the Clinton administration worked with Bob Dole in the Senate to get some trade agreements done that nobody wanted to do before the election. So you could get this economic package done if we were genuinely in a lame duck. And third, quite frankly, we haven't talked about this much yet, is the way that the signals from the White House, still leave the door open to serious civil political violence. The Proud Boys and other groups like that, who, when it's finally ruled, will make it all the more evident as far as they're concerned that maybe Trump got cheated. And I worry a lot about that. And that affects the typical American family in all three of those in some very serious ways.
I agree with what Bruce said, and I might put it this way, which is that a lot of what the administration is doing is harmful to the country in the long run. But what's really harmful to the country in the short run and to the average American family is what the administration's not doing. That is, because they're not focusing on governing in the next 2 months, working with Congress to try to get a stimulus package of some sort passed, because they're not taking the COVID spike seriously and trying to work new measures there, because they're not doing all those things, and instead they're distracting the president's attention and the remaining energy of the administration in another direction. That's the things that are hurting the average American family, I would say. In the long run, it won't help Americans to lose confidence in their electoral process, to believe that voting doesn't matter. That will hurt the country in the long run. But in the short run, these other things will matter more.
Sure. Thank you both for that. And Professor Jensen, I'd like to come back to a remark you just made, because we had a question related to it, which is that given the country we know is divided, that's not really all that uncommon in this country through history. But if President Trump refuses to concede and clings to this notion that he won the election and has a lot of support amongst Americans, how much harder does it make it for Joe Biden to govern if millions of Americans mistakenly think that he stole the election?
It definitely makes it harder. I think Biden is doing, an excellent job. And I don't just say that as a Democrat. There are parts of his policy positions I don't agree with all of them, in trying to be the one with this unity message. I ran as a proud Democrat. I'll govern as an American president. I'm sure behind the scenes he's saying some very different things than mildly intimidated about as Republican, but he understands what his role is. And so I think the notion, especially because there's so little basis for it. I mean, you really get into, some of the wildest conspiracy theories, and that's very dangerous. The other thing I think is when you break norms like we're doing now, it's very hard to get them back. And one can imagine any number of things, whether it's in Congress or 2024 election, which aren't even as serious, but with the norms broken, when the rules of the game are broken, again, you can think of sports analogies there too. It's really hard to patch them up in the shape that they were. And so there's both kind of what Peter was saying before about things. There's both the immediate effects on governing and conveying to people that this was a just election. And again, I'd be much more worried if it was 270 as the final count, or if there were, 537 votes like there were in Florida in 2000 that made the difference in the election. It's not. But I think that, for people that are Trump followers, it's, frankly, a bit cultish. And so I worry about it immediately, as well as, when people really are trying to put the country back together as a strong democratic system, what the lasting impact's going to be.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. And thanks again to everybody for the questions that are coming in. And I have a question now, and Professor Feaver, we'll start with you, but I'd certainly like to get both of your perspectives on this. And it references a comment that Professor Jensen made a few minutes ago, in that how would a delayed transition impact the COVID-19 response specifically? Based on your response with administrations, are there ways in which you think that in particular could be slowed down, that could be dangerous?
Well, I'm not a public health expert, but the public health experts I trust and read say that we need to take dramatic action now. I'm thinking now of the people who are the senior experts inside the Trump administration, Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, they are saying that action now will have a meaningful dampening effect on the spread of the virus. We have great news with a vaccine that appears to be effective and that might come online in a couple months and start to have an effect at a population level in the spring. But between now and then, there's a lot that needs to be done, and that if it's not being done, then people will die. And so I think you can, when Vice President Biden called for a national mask wearing mandate, whether it has to be a mandate or just has to be a norm that people do it, if President Trump were to change his messaging on masks and just embrace that, I think that could have a powerful effect, a dampening effect. There's also reports of PPE shortages in hospitals again, which is a stunning fact in the richest country in the world, 8 months into the pandemic, that there's still PPE shortages. That's stunning. But that requires federal action to move supplies around again. Things like that are very tangible steps that the Trump administration could do to dampen the pandemic so that when the Biden administration takes over, they're dealing with a less severe problem. This was one of the great successes of the Bush administration that people forget. But the Bush administration was dealing with a financial crisis at the end of its term and was handing over a financial crisis to and an economic challenge to Obama. And they managed that handover very well, not just the overall transition and not just the inside baseball stuff we've been talking about, but the decisions that were being made about dealing with the financial crisis were well coordinated across Bush and Obama, so that when Obama came in, yes, he faced a serious economic financial challenge, but it was less serious than it would have been without that responsible action and responsible inter-administration coordination from the two. And so that's the kind of thing that we should be asking for now, that we have a serious health and an economic crisis.
Sure, thank you. Go ahead, Professor Jenelson.
I definitely agree with Peter on that Bush to Obama transition on that and a number of other issues. You know, on the COVID issue, you know, we can learn a lot from our Australian friends. So I was actually on a visiting professorship earlier in the year at Australian National University when COVID hit. And when I got to Australia, it was sort of the tail end of the bushfires. Very divisive issue, as well as a terrible event with a conservative government, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who's taking huge criticism for the way he mishandled the environmental issues in the bushfire. COVID hits, and everybody bands together, both at the federal and the state level, both parties, and they do an excellent job. We left to come home, but they did an excellent job of putting COVID under control. Then in the summer, there was an outbreak in Victoria around Melbourne. But because they had gotten it under control, they could concentrate on that particular outbreak with resources, with messaging. And indeed, Melbourne lifted its restrictions 2 weeks earlier than they thought they were going to have to. So if we just let it continue to spread, the ability to get your arms around it are that much more difficult than if we start to get a handle on it and then make a real concerted effort once Biden's in office.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you both for that. And to Professor Feaver, to come back to you, your comment about the Bush administration, you've obviously worked in Democrat and Republican administrations. And we had a question asking if there are any particular examples you can give from your experience. And of course, you just cited one with handing over the financial crisis to the Obama administration. Any firsthand experience, firsthand examples you can provide to give people a sense of what would normally be happening right now at this early stage of a transition. Professor Jenelson, I know that you'll have some opportunity to weigh in here too.
Well, I was already out of the administration at the time of the handoff. So this is not a first person account, but this is a well-reported account, which was that there was serious concern that terrorists would use the transition period, and indeed maybe even use Inauguration Day itself, to launch a strike, a mass casualty strike in the United States. And so the Bush administration did a war game with the incoming Obama administration people, with the people whom President Obama had identified, this will be my national security advisor, this will be my Homeland Security secretary, and so forth. And they sat side saddle with their Bush equivalents and did what's known as a tabletop exercise, where they actually go through an actual crisis. And I believe this one had a biological weapon component to it. So it was particularly apt. But the point was that that allowed the Obama people to see, okay, this is what will be done. If it happens the day before, this is what the Bush people will be doing, so that when you take over at 12:01, you will know that this is where this unit is, this is what is happening. If it happens the day of, if it happens while the motorcade is driving to the inauguration, this is what we'll do. And this is where we'll take the Obama people so that they're in the command post, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of very nitty-gritty planning, as it turns out, we didn't have a crisis and we didn't need to have it tested. But that kind of thing makes the incoming team less unprepared than they would otherwise be. People may not realize this, but the United States government, the executive branch, does a lobotomy every time they do a transition. They lop off the top 3,000-4,000 political appointees who are managing national security and other policies. And sometimes they take the entire safe with all of the information. It leaves the office and goes to the archives, and the incoming team comes in at 12:05 and there's an empty office and they're in charge. And that's a crazy way to run a government, but that is the American system. There are now laws to better improve the transition planning so that the incoming team has a much better understanding of where the policies are, and they're not facing empty safes. They have access to all the information they need. And the Bush administration did that extremely well. In fact, it's now the 08 transition, 08 to 09 transition is sort of the gold standard of what can be done. And the Obama people were very gracious about it.
Yeah, I just had two examples. I think, Peter, those examples are really powerful ones, particularly the terrorist threat around Inauguration Day. So going back to the George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton, Al Gore transition in 92, 93, I was involved in that. And one of the things that we did was we actually reached out to Republican leaders in the Senate. And we met with aides to Senator Bob Dole on issues like, how to handle the war powers issue that had always been difficult, and general presidential congressional relations, and took in memos from them to part of the process. Now, I actually think the Biden people will try to do that, but I think they're not getting much support, at least at this point, either on the Hill or the White House. The other example was going back to 2000 and the earlier question about 9/11, a 9/11 commission. So there are a lot of bipartisan task forces and commissions that always happen in presidential election years. And there was one, it was called the Hart-Rudman Commission. It was Gary Hart, Democratic senator from Colorado, Warren Rudman, Republican senator from New Hampshire. I think the title of it was something, American National Security in the 21st century. And I was designated one of Al Gore's representatives to it, and the Bush campaign had a representative. We were briefed then, on things like catastrophic terrorism. And so had we come into office, we already had not certain material we had some clearances, but not all of them. But we were already thinking about this, and we're getting good briefings. The Trump people, had they stayed in office, weren't really interested in this sort of thing. As far as I know, Peter may know some examples that go the other way, but it's a very important part of the process that happens in that sort of, area that links the two, Democratic world and the Republican world that's not necessarily in government, that feeds into the next administration. All of those are really important. And there may be some examples now, but not nearly what there've been in past transitions.
Well, this allows me to finally disagree with Bruce on something. So I will agree. We've been in violent agreement up until now, and that's not good for our brand. We have to disagree about something. The Trump team, at the level of the transition director, Little, and below, I believe, is actually doing all of the things that Bruce described. I think they're preparing the binders. I think they're doing a professional job. It's my understanding that the receiving teams at the various departments and agencies will be ready to receive the landing teams. Now, will DOD, because they just lost several of their top people, that's probably complicated their preparation a little bit. But the problem, I don't think, is at that level and below. Those people, I think, will be professional. The problem is that they are being prevented from doing their job by the political shenanigans that's happening way above them, basically at the pinnacle of the Trump campaign. Once that's lifted, once we go to regular order, then I think they'll move out and will attempt to run an orderly transition process. That's my hope.
Gotcha. Thank you both very much for that. We are, as they say in the country, getting into the short rows, but we have some time. So if people want to submit more questions, you can do so via the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom, or use *9 to raise your hand if you are on the phone. But we will press forward with some more questions that we have. Professor Gentleson, you mentioned a little while ago about the damage to norms that govern so much of how power is transferred and how elections are held. And 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐏𝐚𝐧𝐞, the Dean of the Sanford School, who works in election observation, made the same point, that we rely on these norms and they can't necessarily be codified in law. Are there any particular norms that the Trump administration has put under stress that you worry have been damaged beyond repair that could come back to haunt us in 2024 or in the future?
I don't think anything is ever damaged beyond repair. Well, there are some things, but I think, we think, there's a vibrancy and robustness to our society and our political system. But, these go back much further. I mean, the number of falsehoods and lies that this president has told throughout his administration, culminating in what we're seeing now when he got on TV and the networks actually had to cut him off. Even Fox News cut off the press secretary the other day when she was saying things that they just determined were false. To be crass about it, if a future president, lied 10% as much, we might consider that an improvement. That's not good. And so I think the basic conduct of it, and there's fault on both sides. Democrats are far from angels, but the damage that this administration has done, to the electoral process, the voter suppression efforts that have been going on, really more from the Republican side than the Democratic side, not this election, but 2018, in states like Georgia, particularly, those are just ways in which, we all play to win, but there are ways of playing to win that, may even bend a rule here and there, but don't break as many there. And norms are those intangibles, you have them in a family life where there's certain norms that spouses have with each other or parents with their children. And we all know that when you break those norms, it makes relationships a lot harder. So I think we've seen more norm breaking from this president, this administration. And I lived through Nixon, and all that sort of thing. And that was another example, but I think this is of a magnitude that's of a different order.
Sure, thank you. Professor Feaver, slightly different question for you. You've mentioned transitions in a time of crisis. Back in 2000, even though we didn't know it, there was the growing terrorist threat. And in 2008, the Bush administration had to hand over during the financial crisis. And of course, now we are in the middle of a pandemic. And given that this is another crisis transition, as you watch, is there anything in particular that you are most concerned about that this transition is going to hobble the new administration for? We've talked about COVID. Is it that, or are there other things that you think people aren't talking about that they should be worried that this slowed transition could hurt?
Well, in order to deal with the pandemic and the economic crisis, we still have an economic crisis that is linked to the pandemic. You need to have both branches of government, the executive branch and the legislative branch, working together and making compromises. And so one of the norms that I saw challenged over the last 4 years that's troubling is the idea that it's okay to compromise and get half the loaf and then move and win the next half in the next round. That's okay. Compromise is not an abdication with the enemy. Compromise with the other political party is not evil. That requirement, compromise is built in. That's what our founding documents required, was compromise across things. And in the last 4 years, we've seen that become so sharply attacked by both sides, but especially by the Trump administration, thus making it harder for Republicans. Let's say that it is President Biden. Let's say that the Republicans hold the Senate, which is probably, if you had to bet money, is what you would bet at this stage. Then Biden and the Republican Senate are going to have to work together. But the last 4 years have shown that to be very, very difficult to do because of this demonization of each side demonizing the other. And so that's the one that I worry about going forward in terms of hobbling then President Biden in responding to the challenges.
Sure, thank you for that. We've had another question come in, and I would love to get both of your perspectives on. We talked about the perceived legitimacy of the election, but the question is, what is it going to take to get half the country to accept the outcome of an election if the president continues to insist that it's invalid?
Well, the polls show that a lot of people who voted for President Trump nevertheless believe that President Biden won. They're not happy about it. They wish it had gone the other way, but they think Biden won. So the portion of people who are genuinely believe that this election was quote unquote stolen, that proportion is not 70 million. It's something less. It's still very high, but it's something less. And here is where the Republican Party will have a lot of work to do over the next several years. The Republican Party will be looking ahead to 22, to the midterm elections. Below the level of president, the Republicans had a pretty good election day. They certainly beat expectations, and they'll be looking to build on that success and maybe even win back the House. And of course, the 2024 election begins on day one. And if President Trump files for that campaign, as some have suggested he will, then the problem you identify is going to be very acute, because of course he has an incentive to stoke that message. But if he doesn't, then you'll see other Republican candidates, Senator Cotton, Ambassador Nikki Haley, maybe Secretary Pompeo. There's quite a number of people who will be running for president. They'll be trying to appeal to Trump voters, but they're not going to be imitating, I don't believe, Trump and Trump's rhetoric. And I think they will have an incentive to modulate the rhetoric about election fraud, because they'll be trying to motivate people to show up and vote. And it's very hard to motivate people to show up and vote if you tell them you vote and it's meaningless, the whole system is rigged. Many, many Republicans believe that President Trump committed a political malpractice and an own goal when he messaged against mail-in ballots. He hurt his cause. He might have won if he hadn't mounted that message over the last 6 months. And so they will have those incentives, which will, I think, push back towards the healing process. At least that would be an optimistic take. That's premised on President Trump not running for re-election in 2024.
Yeah, in the immediate term, I think this is where my earlier point about Senator McConnell's role as being second only to President Trump's. I mean, the message really has to be, I don't like the result, but I respect the system. And that's what we did in 2000 with Vice President Gore. And I worry a lot. Sure, it's not all 70 million, but those kind of violent views that have been reinforced, whether it's at Charlottesville or kidnapping the governor of Michigan plot, call out to the Proud Boys in a presidential debate. I worry tremendously about that with any sense, because I don't envision Donald Trump doing anything more than at most a very begrudging, all right, can't do anything else. And so you really need some strong message from the Republican Party that has to start with their second most powerful person, the Senate Majority Leader, who will probably be the Majority Leader going forward. Governors, otherwise, it's just going to be Joe Biden saying I won and trying to be gracious in victory. But I'm very concerned about about the civil violence that this can further foment and feed into.
Thank you both very much for that. We are about to wrap up. I have one more question for both of you, and I think it's a question that millions of people are wondering. And it's, if we reach to January 20th and President Trump has not conceded and is continuing to insist that he won, what happens on the 20th? Is there some spectacular firework display at the White House? Is it kind of a non-event and everybody just ignores him and the machinery of government continues to move but switches its focus to Biden? I mean, given that we know the election results will be certified by then, one way or another, and it looks most likely Biden will be president, what happens on the 20th if the president has refused to accept that reality?
That's an easy one to answer. He does not have to go to the inauguration. There doesn't have to be a parade. There doesn't have to be a ceremony on the Capitol lawn. Those are all, extras. And in a time of COVID, it probably will be socially distanced and reduced anyway. But as of 12 o'clock on Inauguration Day, he is no longer president. And then to stay in the White House, you have to have be cleared by the Secret Service to be there. And so as of 12:01, he has to be invited by then President Biden to stay in the White House. And if not, he'll be escorted off of the premises by the Secret Service. And I'm sure he does not want to see the image of him being frog marched off the compound. And so much more likely is that he will have already decamped to Mar-a-Lago many, many weeks earlier. And he will be tweeting, but he will not be tweeting from the White House proper. And if he is tweeting from the White House proper, he will be escorted off the compound as of 12:01.
Yeah, I think just think about that. If you went to a publisher in New York with this as your plot line 5 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe, well, let's say 5 years ago, I'm not sure they would have told you that they'd buy your novel. You might be able to sell it on Facebook, but that's a different story. It's gonna be a very different inauguration anyway, because you can't have, the parties and the parades to that extent. I think there will be a parade. I'm on the board of directors for a nonprofit foundation that works with high school students around the country. Normally we bring 2,000-3,000 students to Washington to experience the inauguration. We're not going to do that. So it'll be different, but hopefully it can be different, like, in a creative way that, that makes it positive. If we get to that point, I think Peter's right. It's time to go. But just think about the fact that we're actually considering that as a plausible, not probable, but as a plausible scenario. That's quite frightening in itself.
It certainly is, and I can't think of a better place to leave it. So we'll call it there. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Peter Feaver and Bruce Gentleson, for sharing your perspectives. And this briefing will address how a Biden administration can do differently to address the COVID-19 pandemic. If you'd like to be on the list for that and other briefings, please email news@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please stay well and be sure to wear a mask.